Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into great books and stories, and another where we just dive into tons of great, interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Yes, we're talking about another episode going west. We've already talked about the steamboats. We've talked about the Erie Canal. We've talked about the Pony Express. But if you wanted to go west, it wasn't about ponies. You're not going to get there on a steamboat. You needed a iron horse. You needed the train. Now, we're talking about the time period just prior to the Civil War. When we were going west, there was the conflict that ultimately would explode with the election of Abraham Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln planted the seed. He knew, or he certainly hoped, that our country would still be intact and the West was the future. But the railroads, you see, they didn't begin, obviously, in the West. There were plenty in the East. In the 1820s and the 1830s, there were short rail lines that appeared in places like Philadelphia, Baltimore. As a matter of fact, one of the earliest railroads that were chartered was in 1827, and that was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. But the trains were small. Some of them were even pulled by horses. But the steam engine became a reality, and it moved boats, and shortly, sure enough, it moved trains. The steam pushed the pistons turned the wheels, and these iron wheels rolled along iron rails. The railroads at this point in the 1850s, they did connect New York City to Chicago, and St. Louis became this huge gateway to the West, and towns were springing up all along the journey. Here I am in northern New Jersey, and my town was pretty much created with the trains going through. My town would not exist if it wasn't for the train going through. But the railroad at this time in the 1850s stopped at the Missouri River. Beyond that, the Great Plains, mountains, deserts, almost 2,000 miles of nothing but wild, open land and no way. Yes, there was a way to get there. We covered that in the Oregon Trail, wagon trains, but it took forever. What if you could get a railroad across the country to California, West Coast? That was the dream. But who would build it? For years, politicians argued, let's go north. Let's go south. But of course, this was the whole purpose, the whole reason that we had a war. Obviously, so going west, north and south, slavery, no slavery, this was a roadblock that no train was going to go through. It was a stalemate. And then, yes, the Civil War started. The southern states left Congress, and the northern leaders now had the votes to act. And like so many great things that ultimately were done, it was done because the South was no longer in Congress. They seceded. They left our country. So in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. It created two companies, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad went west. It started in Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific Railroad started in Sacramento, in California, and they went east. They would build towards each other. The Central Pacific Railroad was led by four California businessmen that became known as the Big Four. Leland Stanford, who, yes, ultimately started Stanford University. Collins Huntington, Mark Hopkins Jr., and Charles Crocker. All four of these men started with humble beginnings on the East Coast. And it's interesting because they took advantage They became businessmen out in California, taking advantage of the gold rush. Stanford, he was a shopkeeper who ultimately became the governor of California. Huntington, he ran a hardware store. Hopkins, he was a bookkeeper. And Crocker, he was the builder. Crocker ultimately became the person that oversaw the building of the railroad. Hopkins, his job was basically to watch the finances, keep the expenses in line, all during this time period. Huntington, he oversaw all the infrastructure, the shipping, the purchasing of the equipment. He was basically the vice president. And Stanford, he was the president. He was the president of the railroad, and along with being governor, lots of conflict of interest there, but this was about making this railroad be complete for the benefit of all in California, and he had a lot of political influence. His job was lobbying in Washington and getting everything done. But especially early on, there was one person that was more important than these big four. It was a young engineer by the name of Theodore Judah. He was brilliant. He was obsessed. He was determined. He believed the railroad could cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, something that most people thought was impossible. He surveyed the mountains himself. He mapped the passes. He convinced the big four that it could be done. I mean, we'll talk about this later, but the Sierra Nevada mountains and then going through the Rocky Mountains, the job that needed to be done was almost lunacy. But he was the man that got the big four together. He convinced them to put up the money. It was his vision. It was his idea. Without his lobbying in Washington, D.C. and going to President Abraham Lincoln, the funding from the government wouldn't have happened to begin with. But this story for Judah has a very tragic ending. The relationship between him and the big four started to crumble. He believed that the railroad had to follow a route that he had carefully surveyed. The decisions should be controlled by the engineers. And yeah, this needs to be on the up and up. What did the big four believe? They were the ones with the money. They risked everything. So they wanted to control the corporation, the company that actually ran and built the railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad. So what did the big four do? They created a separate construction company, was later known as the Contract and Finance Company, and that they controlled. This meant, check this out, that they were effectively paying themselves to build the railroad at a government-subsidized rate. The government gave both of these companies, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, a certain amount of money per mile of track that they laid. We'll get into this later, but know this. Judah thought this was wrong. He was furious. He didn't think that this was ethically the right way to do it. He worried that the railroad was going to be built cheaply, improperly, and very simply, that he was being tossed aside. Here he was. This was his vision. It was his dream. He's the one that started it, and now he's being pushed to the side. In June 1863, Judah met with the Big Four in California. The meeting went horribly. Like I said, Judah wanted more control. He wanted to restructure the corporation. And he wanted new investors. And the Big Four said, nope, no way. The meeting was a total debacle. Judah was demoralized, but he had faith. His purpose now was to go back east, get new investors, start up from the beginning. His plan was first to go to New York and then to Washington. But he never made it there. Listen to this. On his way back, remember, he didn't go back through the countryside, through the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains. No, the two choices, as I've talked about in previous episodes, when you're going from east to west or vice versa, your choice was to go around the tip of South America or go through the Isthmus of Panama. At age 37, he passed away from yellow fever that he contracted by going through Panama. It was November 2nd, 1863, and now the Big Four had control of everything. Everything, that is, for the Central Pacific. Back east, the Union Pacific began in Omaha, Nebraska. It was backed by investors, primarily this gentleman by the name of Thomas Durant. He pushed aggressively to build quickly. See, the Central Pacific, like I said, they had to blast through mountains. The Union Pacific, they just had to go across the Great Plains. But just like anything else, they had to deal with extreme weather, and they had to deal more so with the Native Americans that were not happy that they were crossing their land. Now, to back up a second, just so it's clear, this all started on July 1st, 1862, when this Railway Act was signed by President Lincoln. This chartered both of the companies, and the Central Pacific, they started on January 1863, but the Union Pacific, they didn't start construction until July of 1865. Now, I spent so much time talking about the Big Four, and Judah, they started this process, but ultimately Lincoln, there was a big meeting. Judah ended up going to the Big Four early on with good news. They expected the good news, but when the news came, no, Judah told them that Lincoln said, we're not going to give it to one company. We're going to give it to two. So they got half the money that they expected. And here's how the railway was funded. And this became a problem. Listen to this. The loans that they got were from $16,000 to almost $50,000 per mile of track that was built. And it depended upon the train. The easiest, the flattest portions of the railway, $16,000 per mile. Like I said, it was about $50,000. It was actually $48,000 through the toughest terrain in the Sierra Nevada. In addition to this, they were given land grants. They were given millions of acres of public land that was alongside the tracks, all to support these two companies to get the job done. It was good for the public. It was good for the states. But because all this money was being shelled out, it became a race to see who could build the track the quickest because money was at stake. This was good, but it was also bad at the same point. So, how did they actually build a railroad? Workers first had to flatten the land. They created a raised dirt path called a grade. Next, they lay wooden beams across the path. Those wooden pieces are called ties, railroad ties. Next comes the crushed rock. It holds everything steady and it helps with drainage. On top of the ties, the workers placed the long iron rails parallel to each other. And where did the iron come from? Factories all along the East Coast. And finally, once those steel rails were lined, workers drove large iron spikes through holes in the rail plates right there adjacent and into those wooden ties. How did they do this? With heavy sledgehammers. One swing, two swings, three swings, thousands of times per day. Just think of John Henry, the steel-driving man. Where was the hardest part? Like I mentioned before, the Sierra Nevada. They had to cross it. Granite mountains, snow 20 feet deep, cliffs. To get through, the workers had to use black powder and later nitroglycerin to blast through these tunnels. This nitroglycerin was very dangerous. And by the way, who are these workers? Most of them are from China. The Chinese hung in baskets over cliffs to drill holes into the granite. Yes, they actually weaved these baskets themselves. But you have to picture this. At some point in the Sierra Mountains, the gorges and the drop was so deep, they couldn't build a bridge. and they certainly couldn't tunnel. So what did they do? They went around the mountain. They carved into the side of the mountain. You talk about dangerous work. You drill into the side of the mountain, hanging above. When I say drill, you hammer a rod into the rock. You would hope that the person using the sledgehammer that would hit the rod wouldn't hit you. If that was done, the hole would have to be big enough, and then you would have to put enough powder in the hole. Not too much, not too little, and then light the fuse and then run. In the case of building on the side of the mountain with the Chinese, you had to go up and just hope and pray. So many people passed away during this phase of the building of the railroad. It was just so tragic. And keep this in mind, this wasn't just beautiful weather all the time. You had the most snow and the most cold at any place other than Alaska, right here in this mountain range, and they had to work through it. And that's what they literally did in some cases. They tunneled through snow. Snow at this point, they had some of the worst winters. Snow was 20 to 40 feet deep in places. Entire camps were buried. Supplies were cut off. Avalanches were common. So the Chinese laborers actually dug passageway through the packed snow just to reach and get supplies back and forth. They created these trenches between structures. In some cases, they dug temporary snow caves just to get through these storms. And because of all the dangers for snow stopping the work, they built 40 miles, listen to this, 40 miles of wooden snow sheds that covered the track through the mountains. Now, as I mentioned before, with the Union Pacific, they had an easier go of it. A lot more land that was accessible. It was easier to build, but they still had a lot of issues, primarily with the Native Americans. The tribes that were affected were the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. And to these tribes, the railroad meant the end of their way of life. It was a permanent settlement now. It was scaring away their buffalo. And it brought soldiers into their land. There were raids across the Platte River in 1867 and 1868. The construction crews reported that the supply trains were attacked, the telegraph poles were cut down, tracks were torn up. So many of the Union Pacific workers, who remember, many of them were Irish. A lot of them carried rifles to protect themselves and make sure that they could keep the tracks being built, and the U.S. Army came out to support them. So now here we are, 1868. The hardest mountain work was behind them. The Central Pacific had crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains and was racing east across Nevada and into Utah. The Union Pacific had crossed Nebraska and Wyoming and were still pushing west. But, as I alluded to before, greed set in. I told you, the federal government was paying them, and they would pay them the more miles that they laid tracks. So every mile meant more money, more land that they could later sell, and of course, more profit. Speed mattered. But there was this argument. Where are they going to meet? The thought was somewhere in the Utah territory, but there was no meeting point set in stone. So what did they do? They kept building. In some places, they graded land. They were running parallel to each other, just miles apart. By the early 1869, both companies had actually pushed past where they should have met. This became ludicrous, absurd. The president, Ulysses S. Grant, at this point, stepped in. He wasn't happy. They were funding the project, obviously, and now the companies were wasting money just competing for extra miles. So they settled on this area in northern Utah, Promontory Summit. That would be the place where they would meet and the railroad would be complete. So the day was May 10th, 1869. A golden spike was hammered in and a message was sent out to the world via telegraph. Done. So to wrap up our podcast on the Transcontinental Railroad, a few other interesting facts. There were 19 tunnels built, 15 by the Central Pacific, 4 by the Union Pacific. It was built during the Civil War. We talked about this, but imagine this. How could this be done? It covered almost 2,000 miles, laying tracks usually about 3 to 4 miles a day. At one point, they actually laid 10 miles of track in one day. How many Chinese laborers worked? Over 10,000. A lot, thousands of Irish immigrants, as I mentioned before, worked on the Union Pacific Railroad. Towns grew up along the tracks. How about this one? Time was actually created. Before the railroads, every town kept its own local time. Railroads, they forced our country to create the time zones in 1883. The buffalo population was completely destroyed. A future episode, no doubt. Very, very tragic. And the original companies, the Central Pacific was eventually absorbed into the Southern Pacific Railroad, and the Union Pacific is still around today. Today, Amtrak brings people back and forth across our country. And freight, goods, products all across our country, it's done by still the Union Pacific Railroad. So the aftermath, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. It was danger, it was growth, and was it safe? Not really. So many tracks still with Native Americans were torn up. So many tracks were not built correctly in the rush to build them so quickly that the railroads had to put lanterns in the front of the cars just so the engineers could see what was ahead of them. There was many derailments, actual trains on the same track colliding with each other. These cars were wooden. It was mostly coal-fired steam engines, which was very dangerous. The braking systems were primitive, and yet the railroad still moved on. If you were a worker on the railroad, whether or not you were shoveling coal into the furnace or you were the engineer, this was one of the most dangerous occupations at this time. No question. It was the laborers, it was the average Americans that did the work, got their hands dirty. And who else got their hands dirty? Unfortunately, as a consequence of what happened after this railroad was built, it was found out that one of the greatest scandals in the history of our company happened. The leaders of the Union Pacific had done something sneaky. They set up a secret company and paid themselves, yes, extra money to build the track. So even though the government was giving them money to do the job, they were using this money and quietly putting it into their own pockets. When the truth came out, Americans were not happy. This company that they set up covertly was Credit Mobilier. It was the Credit Mobilier scandal on a par with the Watergate scandal, no doubt for the time. Friends, thanks for staying with me on this journey, learning all about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group called OK Let's Learn. And as always, as I've mentioned, always appreciate the 5-star rating on any podcast platform of your choosing. The reviews are also wonderful as well. Until next time, have fun and keep learning.